Thank you for the honor of being part of your gathering this morning. When Beth Belo first told me about C3, your community captured my imagination. Thank you for that. I appreciate having my imagination captured. When I was in seminary, one of our church history professors became quite animated when discussing the past 2,000 years of the church, suggesting that a major transition had happened every 500 years since its inception. He was thrilled that the next transition was likely to come during our pastorates. The last radical change had been in the 1500s during the Protestant Reformation, so we were overdue for a change. Though he was thrilled, I was not. I was a fan of the status quo. It had served me well. That being said, in the last 20 years as an ordained minister, even I recognize that the status quo that people tend to envision when they think of a spiritual community, that no longer works for many people, and indeed has become harmful for some. When I learn about spiritual communities such as C3, such as your community, I am inspired by folks who are willing to leave the status quo behind, to discover how best to nurture a beloved, covenantal, and adaptive community. But back to the status quo. I met Beth when I was trying to move away from the status quo, at least within the scope of mainline Protestant churches. I was trying out life as a new church start pastor. However, many people who are fond of the status quo aren't really suited for that kind of ministry. We'll get back to that in a moment. And so it was that after starting New Church Start ministry and failing, I was called to my current position as pastor of Suttons Bay Congregational Church. My 16th anniversary of service there is on Friday of this week. I'm crazy grateful that the lively and warm-hearted people of Suttons Bay Congregational welcomed me there 16 years ago, and I continue to feel welcomed and loved as their pastor. While we could never be defined as cutting edge, and indeed some may feel it's quite status quo, what with 3 hymns, a sermon, and communion on the first Sunday of the month, we continue to listen carefully, serve generously, and do our best to love each other well, such that even after all of these years, there's no place I would rather serve. But I do confess to appreciating opportunities to do new things, such as this, every now and again. So thank you. And yet, as honored as I was to be invited and pleased to be part of this new spiritual community, when Beth offered the invitation to be part of one of your gatherings, I hesitated. When she told me that the topic for March would be repentance, and the topic for April was paradox, and then gave me a choice of dates to be with you, my natural inclination was to choose repentance. But March already had so many commitments for me. But I didn't want to talk about paradox in April. I grew up in a place where binary thinking was the name of the game. It was good or bad, right or wrong, black or white, in or out. There wasn't a lot of room for a seemingly absurd or self-contradictory statement or proposition that, when investigated or explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. I thought that based on my background, I was not one to talk to you about paradox. And so I was ready to respond to Beth that I'd do something about repentance in March, when I heard myself utter these 5 little words: I can make that work. I can make that work are the 5 little words that led to my big downfall, which in turn led to my greatest comeback. Thus the paradox into which I have lived every day for the past 17 years, whether I like paradox or not. That downfall involved, among other things, those efforts to be a new church start pastor. It's self-indulgent to tell the story, but it is the story that became the paradox I live every day. Dear Beth, you have heard this story ad nauseum, so now might be a good time to warm up your tea or take Ginger for a walk. It was in the early 2000s, and at the time I had convinced myself that I was going to be the most successful new church start pastor ever. Called by our denomination, the United Church of Christ, to be new church start co-pastors, my then husband, also a clergy person, and I moved to Traverse City from Rhode Island for the opportunity. We were going to start a church that would draw in the masses. It would be a community of radical inclusion that welcomed all God's children. As the extrovert in our marriage / co-pastorate team, I would be the so-called face of the church, shaking hands and kissing babies throughout the Grand Traverse region as we built up enthusiasm for the church. He would work behind the scenes, doing the things he did best. But here's a thing about extroverts pastoring new church starts. There are no people to pastor. So as someone whose energy is fed by the presence of others, I found my energy level quickly dissipating. In addition, I was grieving the life I had in Rhode Island, where I served a congregation of thoughtful and creative people and had worked with colleagues I held in high esteem. I had given all that up to be the most successful new church start pastor ever. And so I kept saying to myself, I can make this work. And yet, it didn't feel like it was working. But one of the ways I thought that I could make it work better was by getting pregnant. But let me be clear. Pregnancy should never be considered a solution for anything other than wanting a child. But at the time I was thinking, what could be more charming and inviting than this new pastor couple with their little baby and their 3 corgi dogs? We would be the total package. And so it was that I was trying to make a new ministry work, a ministry to which I was not well suited. I was trying to make being a first-time homeowner work. I was trying to make living in a new place where I didn't know many people work. I was trying to make a marriage that was falling apart work. I was trying to make preparing to become a new mother work. I was trying to make so many things work that it began to feel like nothing was working. That's when the panic attacks began. And then severe, ceaseless anxiety. And then I stopped sleeping. And then I stopped being able to eat well because swallowing made me anxious. And then I began thinking there was no way out. And then I began looking for ways out. Some way to make the misery end. And because depression and anxiety are noisy, evil, bossy liars, suicide began to seem like a good option for getting out. There was no way I could mother a child, no way I could minister a church. Shoot, I couldn't even take care of those 3 little corgi dogs. Everyone would be better off if I just stopped trying to be the person who would make everything work. Indeed, I thought that everyone would be better off if I just stopped being. And when I asked my then husband to hide the kitchen knives because I was finding them so compelling, he likely saved my life by taking me directly to the emergency department at the local hospital. This was followed by a stay in the psych ward, euphemistically referred to as Center 1 at our local hospital, where my medication regime was worked out and eating and sleeping were regulated. Then there was a partial hospitalization program where I learned valuable skills for living with anxiety and depression. And then there were weeks of therapy during which I worked with a talented therapist to start to try to unfold some of these issues and figure out what was at the core. And was in one of these therapy sessions that this concept of paradox became something I was living, as opposed to something I read about in the books on my shelf. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. After another severe panic attack, my therapist asked, "Is there something about a panic attack that you might consider a blessing?" I am not generally prone to physical violence, but I wanted to kick him in the throat. But after giving it some thought, I began to realize he was right. There was a blessing in it. Though a panic attack is horrific, and if you suffer from them, my heart is with you. Though it's awful, I began to sense that my panic attacks were something more than random psychological events. It turns out they were usually a sign that something in my life was not the right something for me. A few sessions after that revelation, Dr. Callahan said more than he tended to. "Robin, I detect a pattern with you. It seems like every time you tell yourself that you're going to make something work, it's something that may not be the right choice for you." Mind blown. I began reflecting, discovering that many of my life choices that had not led to good outcomes were the result of my "I can make this work" attitude. On more than one occasion, I have wept with gratitude for Dr. Callahan and his insight. Obviously, my "I can make this work" approach to challenging situations, that attitude still rears up at times, just as it did when considering how to fit the writing of a reflection into my already too busy March calendar. All these years later, I am still learning and watching, developing and protecting my personal boundaries, and making choices that lead to better, not worse, mental outcomes. Those 5 little words, "I can make this work," almost always indicate for me that whatever it is I would be trying to make work isn't the something for me. That's not to say that I don't work at stuff. I do. I work at being a responsive mom. I work at being a loving partner to my new husband. I work at being an effective long-term pastor. I still work. I work hard. I love to work. But I work at the right things for me, and that makes my work worth, well, the work. Now, there is, of course, so much more to this story. I trust that it will still reveal new things to me as time goes on. But what I do know is that my great downfall of having a mental breakdown and becoming suicidal when I was 4 months pregnant led to the strong comeback of a compassionate, insightful, calm, and intentional me, most of the time. The great paradox of my life is that the worst thing that ever happened to me is, in many ways, also the best thing that ever happened to me. That's not to say that I don't still struggle with mental health issues. I do. I can make this work are still words that come to me when faced with an opportunity that I want to take for all the wrong reasons. I still have the occasional panic attack, and they are still absolutely awful. And I still feel a little bit like I'm dying or would like to die when I'm having one. But I have a toolbox of things to get me through. The most important of the tools being hope. I imagine that with a genetic propensity towards anxiety and depression, and being in a vocation that is known for its stresses and struggles, a mental health crisis would have overtaken me at some point in my ministry. I'm grateful that my lowest point came early, though if you would have told me that at the time, I might have wanted to kick you in the throat too. I am also so thankful that the bulk of my struggle and all of that learning about my mental health came before my dear Nathan was born. As you well know, there are still many stigmas around mental health issues. People suffer more than they would have to because of the cloak of silence and shame our society wraps around these illnesses. The care I received 17 years ago, it was excellent care, is not care I would receive today because of the influx of mental health patients, the shortage of mental health care providers, and the bizarre level of power that insurance companies have when it comes to determining who gets appropriate care and who doesn't. These are issues that come up with the people to whom I minister time and time again. Thankfully, for many of them, having a pastor who has gone through some stuff and slept on a bed in a psych ward with all sharp objects, belts, and other potential tools of suicide being removed from grasp. Thankfully, that seems to give some folks permission to open up about their own struggles. And perhaps that is another paradox, that my self-indulgent story is a story I tell, not only because the telling of it continues to help me make meaning of it, but also because I have learned that the telling of it has helped others too. And so telling this story has become part of the status quo of my ministry. This story of the worst thing that has ever happened to me, leading to some of the best things that can ever happen to anyone. Meaningful work, fresh starts, new love, and a life of living each day. Just thank